Hello, welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, where we unearth the hidden, the half-forgotten, from the dusty drawers of culture's backrooms. And in this episode, we're going to delve into one of the most controversial corners of popular entertainment, the world of the Victorian freak show, where the abnormal, the extraordinary, the wonderful and the misunderstood were paraded as spectacle and sold as wonder. But who were these so-called freaks? In fact, what does freak mean? Were they human oddities, victims of exploitation, or pioneers of performance who found power in their difference? To help us explore this strange and troubling world, we're joined by Dr. Jacob Woolf, historian and author of The Wonders, Lifting the Curtain on the Freak Show, the Circus and the Victorian Age. John's taken a very deep dive, and a very empathetic dive, I would say, into the lives behind those wonderful posters of the bearded ladies, the living skeletons, and the Siamese twins that captivated crowds and challenged Victorian notions of normality. We'll get into all that, and we're going to discuss how freak shows reflected that society's attitudes towards disability and race and class, and how the legacy still lingers on, perhaps today, in reality TV shows and social media. So this isn't just a journey into the past, it's a sort of cultural reckoning, one that asks who gets to define what normal is, and what abnormal is, and what's freakish. And just before we start, I want to say thanks to my recent correspondents, Stuart, Dave, Chrissy, Ed, Roxy and Paddy, Jason and Logan, who have written in with suggestions or affirmations, which we appreciate very much. You can join us at bureauoflostculture.com. But for now, roll up, prepare to be amazed, or at least a little startled, as we lift the curtain on the Victorian Freak Show. And as I welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, Dr. John Jacob Woolf. Welcome, John.
It says Irish-British historian here. You're actually born in London, though. You're really Irish-British.
I'm a Londoner born and bred,
Yeah.
but my mum's Irish and my dad's British-Jewish. So
Okay.
I thought,
The other thing I'm going to mention is I think you're our first politician.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
because you're a Labour councillor, aren't you?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I've been a kind of councillor for 6 years, 7 maybe, overseeing community safety in Islington. And now I've just moved to overseeing housing. It's a very different world.
Double welcome. We've got a couple of MBEs, but no politicians. So we're going to talk about the subject of The Wonders, your book, and the extraordinary performers who transformed the Victorian Age. And it's about freak shows. Let's just get that out there straight away. But obviously that phrase itself, freak shows, is a difficult one these days, isn't it? Because it implies the notion of freakishness in this context. A lot of it's to do with, say, disability or difference, right? So we're going to use the word freak show, right? Because that's what the Victorians used.
Absolutely.
Is that the best way to approach it?
100%. I'm very clear that you've got a difference between the freak and the freak performer. So the freak is kind of a social construct. It's an image. It's a character on stage brought to life by the freak performer, a individual who has a private life off stage. So when I refer to a freak, I mean very much the social constructed performance on stage. And when I'm talking about individuals, I refer to a freak performer. And yes, it is an uncomfortable word today. And it became sort of more stigmatized, I suppose, in rise of the disability rights movement. Some people were uncomfortable with the term freak. And then it had a sort of renaissance as a kind of countercultural word. Yeah. But it was very much a word that was used at the time from the mid-19th century, freak short for freak of nature. So it's historically fitting, but also I think with that distinction between freak and freak performer, freak as social construction, we're on safe ground.
Okay, got it, yeah. So I think the first thing is, obviously you're a historian as well as a Labour councillor and the author of this book. So what brought you to this subject? It's a fascinating subject, but it's super niche, right?
It's super niche, freak shows. And I predominantly blame my mum, if I'm honest. When I was 9 years old, I was pretty young, she showed me David Lynch's film The Elephant Man.
And my jaw's on the table.
Yeah, I know, I was way too young. And it left such an impression because on the one hand, I was petrified. You see this sort of monstrous being emerging from the shadows of Victorian London. It's very scary. But I was also really drawn to the man, Joseph Merrick, behind the extreme deformities. And so it was that kind of sense of real compassion for him and horror that it kind of stayed with me. And when I went up to university, I did a dissertation on the history of psychiatry, looking at sort of mental health difference and how that was managed in the 19th century, managed in quotation marks. And then it seemed quite natural to return to my interest in kind of physical difference. And that led to an interest in freak shows for a very long time.
I mean, The Elephant Man, it's got to be said, it's a very moving film, isn't it? And a beautiful film. John Hurt, isn't it? I think plays the Elephant Man, isn't it? And we're going to come back to Joseph Merrick, actually, because he's obviously a key figure in the book. And, of course, key figure in London, the history of freak shows in London, right? But okay, so that interest is behind it all, and then you came to do some research specifically on the subject of the Victorian freak show, right?
That's right. I was really interested in looking at how society constructed and managed difference, particularly physical difference, in the 19th century. And to cut a very long story short, I ended up focusing a lot on the stories of the performers themselves. Right. That's what really interested me, because they'd always been kind of sidelined in the history books and largely silent in the archives. So I wanted to see the extent to which I could resurrect their voice and hear them in the 19th century.
Also, we're talking about 19th century, the Victorian era, when I suppose it kind of, became part of mainstream public entertainment, right? But what about before that? Has there always been freak shows or things in this world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the 19th century was the period when the freak show propelled itself into popular consciousness. And, key point, the freak show was never a marginal affair in the 19th century. It was central to Victorian culture. The freak performers were like the Kim Kardashians of their generation. But it had roots way, way back to the medieval periods. And there are kind of two almost paradoxical places in which the freak performer was present, the forerunner to the freak show. The first was in the travelling fairs.
Right.
And they were ancient travelling fairs where goods and people would traverse Europe and the UK, selling their wares, selling their goods, and there'd be performances. And often in those performances, you'd have acrobatics, jugglers, and also freak performers. They were stigmatised, lowly travelling fairs, but people from all social classes went to them.
Also, I imagine that if sort of pre-Victorian era, if you're living particularly in a rural part of this country, and once a year the travelling fair comes by, but it must have been an extremely exciting thing as well. Yeah. They roll into town with all these exotic people doing extraordinary feats of performance, physical performance, acrobats and juggling, etc. And then, of course, these freak performers, these extremely curious things that you never would have dreamed of seeing before.
Absolutely, like the exoticism and the sense of wonder and the excitement, because it wasn't just, we might have in our head the kind of the travelling circus. It was very different to that. It was a sort of assortment of performers, people selling food, people selling books. It was a kind of real market. I suppose a market is a better sort of idea to have
fair,
in our minds.
Like a fair.
Yeah. So they were one spaces, and they old, centuries old. Then the other space, very different to the travelling fairs, was in the royal courts of Europe. And it was, particularly in the early modern period, kings and queens and aristocrats across Europe used to collect people of short stature, dwarves, particularly tall people, conjoined twins, and it was almost like a badge of honour, if you like. Frankly, dwarves were sold, swapped and bred for royalty and aristocracy in the early modern period, very common. So these two places, if you like, travelling fairs and the royal courts, were the kind of forerunners to the freak show.
It's quite interesting because you've got at the bottom end, you've got what you might call the working class culture. You've got the super aristocratic upper class culture.
That's it. And
at both ends, right?
And it kind of was synthesised in the 19th century where all classes came.
Yeah. And the royalty, the aristocracy would keep people, freak performers or people of unusual shape in the way that they would keep a menagerie of exotic animals, right?
Exactly that. And that's, I think, a key point. So, for example, Charles I and his wife Henrietta Maria They had an assortment of people of short stature. They had a giant porter. They had a very old man who was allegedly 151 years old. And they were kind of akin to the dogs and monkeys that they kept as well. They were part of the family. They were loved, but they were pets. They were seen as pets.
Yeah, right. So what happens then in the 19th century that kind of these two ends, the upper class and the lower class, kind of come together in the middle class and everybody's into this thing? Is it to do with leisure time or something else going on in that era?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You've got leisure time. You've got, really, it's kind of the birth of modernity. So you've got rise of commercial culture. You've got the introduction of the Saturday half holiday, which meant people had more time. They had more money to spend on leisure. You had industrialization. Railways meant people could travel more easily, which meant performers could travel more easily. And it was a period culturally when the interest in the body became more paramount. I mean, this was the age of industrialization, so machinery was maiming bodies, famine was starving bodies, the word abnormal entered the lexicon. Scientist and science was emerging in the 19th century. So there was more of an interest in the body and classifying various phenomenon from animals to plants to humans.
Classification was a huge thing, wasn't it? From Darwin and everybody else, it was like, let's sort everything out and give everything a name and all the variations of such. And might it be that medical advances meant that, babies and young children who might be born with oddities or disabilities might have a better chance of surviving?
That almost comes later. That's more of a sort of 20th century thing. And the relationship between medicine and the freak show is an interesting one, because at the start, in the 19th century, at the beginning and the middle, it was very much a mutually beneficial relationship. Scientists, medical fraternity would come to the freak show to observe and study the specimens, the freak performers on stage. The freak showman would use the endorsement of medical men on their pamphlets to give the show an air of respectability and authenticity.
Like, this is a scientific demonstration, everybody.
Yeah.
We're not just doing this because we're all fascinated by
That's it.
freakishness, right?
This is not fake.
Right, okay. It's not fake.
Educated people are patronising this. Come along, this is respectable family entertainment. And a big change in the 19th century was, because of this rise of commercialization, you had an entertainment industry that was burgeoning, and more venues, more places in which freak performers could be displayed. So this all sort of came together.
You've got the venues, you've got the theatres, also the Victorian era. You've got these extraordinary extravaganzas, the huge panoramas.
Yeah.
You just go to a building, a wonderful panopticon or something, and see these huge paintings, and this extraordinary time of the blossoming of a new kind of entertainment, right?
Proliferation of spaces and modes of entertainment. And one of the things that I found interesting was, I didn't find a place where a freak performer didn't perform, whether it was in zoos, menageries, aquariums, apartments, music halls, theatres, circuses. They were everywhere.
You mentioned showmen earlier, and even though we're talking about the Victorian era rather than the 19th century, actually one of the most important figures in this is an American, right? P.T. Barnum. So tell us about that and how he, in a way, kind of galvanised the whole thing.
He is a pivotal figure. It was P.T. Barnum's relationship with a person of short stature, Charles Stratton, also known as General Tom Thumb, who came to Britain in 1844 and performed. And Barnum was a master manipulator and advertiser, and he managed to secure a meeting with Queen Victoria. So General Tom Thumb met Queen Victoria in 1844 3 times. He strolled into Buckingham Palace, and Queen Victoria loved Charles Stratton. She thought he was adorable, he was very funny, he was dressed in a cute costume. He was only 6 years old as well and 25 inches tall.
Right.
And Barnum used Queen Victoria's endorsement of Tom Thumb in his publicity materials in London in 1844. Before she met him, he was struggling to sort of make any waves, if you like. But with that endorsement and Barnum's advertising of that endorsement, you had a freak frenzy in the 1840s. So it was a combination of Barnum's skill as a showman, his ability to sell a story, his ability to create freak performers, because he crafted this image of General Tom Thumb, matched with the skill of a freak performer and the endorsement of Queen Victoria. Perfect combination. Freak show becomes huge.
Right, so he had his American museum in New York already, right, full of oddities, as he would call them, right? But it was actually this coming to the UK, coming to London with, can we call him General Tom Thumb, Charles Stratton?
Yeah,
I mean, that was his stage name,
that was his stage
name. And this meeting, or meetings with Queen Victoria, which kind of exploded it.
It exploded. It made it international. So when he bought his American Museum in 1841, he made some changes to the American Museum. And a big change he made was to centralise freak performers within the American Museum in New York. He meets General Tom Thumb, Charles Stratton, a person of short stature, only 4 years old at the time, living in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He crafts this character, General Tom Thumb. He inflates Charles Stratton's age to 11, and he brings him to New York, to his museum. And Charles Stratton is a big success. He's a great performer. And so that elevated the freak show, because the Dime Museum was very respectable and middle class and family. So suddenly the freak show, which was always seen as a sort of oddity, connected to those travelling fairs, becomes a sort of respectable form of entertainment. And then Barnum internationalises that when he comes to the UK and gets the Queen's endorsement.
Right. With Charles Stratton, let's just talk a little bit about him and what it would mean to be him. So I think he was growing normally for a little while, wasn't he? But then stopped.
So his background, he's born in Bridgeport, Connecticut. His mum was a part-time cleaner. His dad was a carpenter. Barnum comes across him when he's travelling to meet his half-brother. And he transforms him into this General Tom Thumb. He gives him the name. He inflates his age. He actually makes him English rather than American, because he thought English would sell. And so as a toddler, General Tom Thumb, Charles Stratton, is thrust on stage, and he's a natural performer. He's a great performer. Yeah. He's then taken to the UK and to Europe in the 1840s. Is a huge success. Means Queen Victoria, kings and queens of Europe, comes back to America, and he's a rich man. He's a rich person, and he's enriched his family.
Let's talk about that, because there's a whole issue which we're going to come to, I suppose, about exploitation in this area, isn't there? But in this case, and his relationship with Barnum was one that actually he was rewarded by, rather than being completely exploited. He's a natural as well, so in other words, he's freakishly small, but he's super talented and is kind of up for it, right? He's not like a mute attraction who's just going to sit there and people marvel at him. He steps into the role.
100%, and I think it's really important to remember that freak performers did have an element of agency. They didn't just stand there and gawp. They brought to life the freak on stage. They sang, they performed, they recited, they embodied a character. They were actors. And General Tom Thumb was a great actor. But there is an argument that he was very young when Barnum first discovered him. He later in life, he marries another person of short stature in 1863, and he's married in New York. The press are there. It's on the front page of national newspapers. At the height of the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln takes time off to go meet General Tom Thumb. Yeah, he's a huge celebrity.
It's interesting you said that, because you mentioned the Kardashians earlier. It's that without the TV broadcast potential of it, it's that kind of stature, right, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And then he goes on a world tour. He does develop health problems later. He overspends. He has a drinking problem, and what's so odd about his story in a way is he wrote like nothing, and we don't have his voice. So what he really felt, we don't know. Right. He was born and raised effectively in the world of the freak show, and it rewarded him. He and his family. He lived in mansions. He had yachts that he used to sail around. He became a member of a Masonic lodge. He had a lot of money. and for a person of short stature in the 19th century, what are your options? Destitution, dependency on the workhouse or an institution, dependency on family, or employment in the freak show and a chance at stardom. So it's a complicated one.
In his case in particular, because he did, as you said, as far as we know, step into the role with enthusiasm and live it, it seems somehow more acceptable, doesn't it? Or less questionable somehow. Although, as you say, we don't know what he thought, or maybe any sort of tribulations that he went through. It could be that he just absolutely loved it.
Yeah. And I mean, in a way, for some reason, Justin Bieber's come to mind. I don't know why, but, a young person who was thrust into the limelight, lived his life through social media. And so we've experienced what he's experienced in terms of his ups and downs. And I think, Charles Stratton had similar battles and demons to fight, but was it complete exploitation? I don't buy it.
There's something freakish about stardom being thrust upon very young people anyway, isn't it? It's a troubling thing, isn't it, often in later life. So Barnum and Charles together, in a way, ignite this explosion of the freak show, not only here and in the States, but around the world. And then, of course, he goes on and expands his kind of repertoire, doesn't he, Barnum? Yeah,
so he goes on to work with other performers. He develops the circus. He revolutionises the circus, the big top travelling circuses. He becomes a politician. He was a successful polymath, if you like, who pursued a range of different careers and forms of entertainment. He was a great self-promoter, wrote lots of autobiographies and books, constantly merged fact and fiction. But General Tom Thumb, well, actually Joyce Heth before Tom Thumb was a paralysed blind slave who he lugged across the northeast of America. That one is more exploitative. He first found fame on the back of her, but it was General Tom Thumb that really internationalised that fame.
And as soon as one person gets success at it, lots of other people can try and get involved too. And of course, there's lots of other performers in Changaneng Bunker, right? The conjoined twins from Thailand, we would say, Siam as it was then. So and which starts this thing, the Siamese twin, doesn't it, as it became known. So tell us about them.
Again, another fascinating story discovered discovered in quotation marks, I should say, in Siam, today's Thailand, brought to England and first performed in 1829, literally 10 minutes from here. At the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly. In 7 months, 100,000 people came to see them. They were such a draw, and the medical fraternity flocked all around them, in particular to inspect their connecting ligament.
Right.
And they were performers. They performed on stage, they answered questions on stage, they did somersaults on stage, they played an early form of badminton with each other, which considering...
What?
Yeah, I know, it's mad. What a spectacle.
And so for anybody who doesn't know, they were conjoined twins, joined at the chest, basically, where they shared a liver.
Yeah.
I think that was it. Probably these days would be able to be separated.
Possibly.
But certainly not then, right? But again, it's sort of so complicated, isn't it? Because what would their chances have been if they had been back in Thailand at that time? We don't really know, do we? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And were they happy to come? I mean, what do we know about them?
Well, so what we do know is they wrote a whole series of letters, and the longer they were in the UK, under the management of Western protectors, as they were referred to, let's call them their managers, they got increasingly disgruntled with how they were managed. They didn't think they were making enough money. They thought they were working too hard. They wanted to spend their own money in their own way, and they were being curtailed. So on their 21st birthday, they became, in their own words, their own men. And they discarded their Western management, the white people that were managing them, and they became their own managers. And so they travelled around America displaying themselves, and they made a lot of money. So much so that in 1843, they settled down in North Carolina, bought land, bought some houses, and married 2 white sisters in the American South.
Not conjoined sisters.
Not conjoined sisters, no. And
I mean, it's
mad.
Such an astonishing story, isn't it? You can't really get your head around it. I mean,
you can't make it up.
Because also, I suppose, just physically, the fact that they're able to do so much is extraordinary, isn't it? You're actually joined to another being, your twin. And yet you can play badminton, you can perform, as you say, do all this stuff as well, and move around the world, manage yourself in a world where everywhere you go, people are going to be turning to look at you, right? In every situation that you're in, people are going to be staring at you.
Yeah,
right?
you're other, completely. Not only physically, but ethnically as well.
Ethnically as well, right. And yet they made a success of it.
I found it just so fascinating that the world of the freak show was their ticket to normalcy.
Right.
Because they settled in North Carolina, they married, they fathered 21 children between them, and get this, they became American fathers, husbands, farmers, and slave owners in the American South. They owned their own plantations with their own slaves. And later in life, they did the odd freak performance with some of their children. So they straddled this weird world between freakery, normalcy, and when they died, their friends in their community in North Carolina, a number of them were desperate to get hold of their bodies to sell them to the Royal College of Physicians. So there was always a sense they were always kind of different and other, but they also led this normal life with a normal family.
Well, not only that, but became exploiters themselves. So they actually had slaves.
And had slaves.
Right.
And they dealt in children. That was their thing. They had child slaves and they sold child slaves. I mean, messed up.
Really messed up, right? The people around them, their community, there's a sort of vulture-like sort of, we're waiting for them to die because I'm assuming that, they would have to die at the same time, right? So, but who's going to get the body? Because the body himself would be valuable to sell to something like a pathology museum. Saying what actually happened to the bodies?
So they were shipped to the Royal College of Physicians in Philadelphia. They were dissected. Their liver was taken out, and then they were brought back and buried.
So actually, it was Chang that suffered a stroke, and then Eng died a few years after him, right? Possibly from shock or circulatory issues. Yeah. So we mentioned him earlier. Let's talk about Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man. A few years ago, I went to see his skeleton, which is at the Royal Hospital. There is a 3D version of it there too, which I think people can go and see. But at that time, they were honouring his wish not to be exhibited anymore. So the skeleton was just available for educational purposes in a private room. Tell us about him for anybody who doesn't know. You mentioned the film that you saw when you were 9, and of course he becomes one of the most well-known figures of this Victorian freak show.
He was born in Leicester to a working class family, and suffered extreme deformities. He had a limp, he had flesh growing from his face and the side of his body. Cut a very long story short, he was unable to work, and so he presented himself to the Leicester Union Workhouse, and where he resided, and he decided to enter the world of the freak show in order to make a living. We can talk. I think that's interesting in and of itself. Unfortunately, he was exploited. He was robbed on the continent, in Brussels. Manages to make his way back to London, where he is rescued, very much in quotation marks, by a renowned London surgeon, Frederick Treves, who brings him to the London hospital, where Merrick is permitted to stay. And he spends his days in quiet leisure and seclusion, although he's very much a sort of pathological medical freak within that institution. People could come and see him. He was photographed for medical purposes.
Was that the deal in a way that, okay, you can live here in seclusion, we'll take care of you, but you have to make yourself available for visitors to come and have a look?
Yeah, and medical visitors. And there was lots of medical photographs taken of him. And he became, friends with some celebrities who would come and visit him. What was interesting is when he died, there was a big spat, if you like, between Frederick Treves, the surgeon, and this is where the film comes from. The film uses Frederick Treves' narrative. He wrote about it in his autobiography, and Treves presents the story as poor Joseph Merrick, awfully deformed, true, went into the freak show where he was exploited, true to an extent, came to me, I saved him. I gave him a place of solitude where he could spend his days happily. Sort of true. Joseph Merrick's London showman, who had displayed Merrick in the East End of London in the 1880s, wrote a counter-narrative that said, hang on a minute, the freak show was not as exploitative as you say it was, and you've completely maligned me, by the way. And this guy's maligned in David Lynch's film as well. He's presented as this horrific showman who's drunk all the time, and actually Tom Norman was a teetotaler and a very decent man. And he was saying that Joseph Merrick had extreme deformities, true. He chose to enter the freak show, true. He was well treated in the freak show, true, until he was exploited, true. He then goes to the surgeon who exploits him in another way, who has total access to his body, who deprives Merrick of his ability to earn his own money, which is an interesting point. In the 19th century, for a working class man like Joseph Merrick, masculinity was connected to your ability to earn a living. Respectability was earning your own living. Merrick did that in the freak show. He didn't do it institutionalized and dependent in a London hospital. So again, was he exploited by Frederick Treves? To an extent he was. Was he exploited in the freak show? To an extent he was.
But his agency was taken away, effectively, when he's in the Royal London Hospital, right? And it's certainly presented that way in the film, isn't it? That he is this very gentle soul, isn't he? Very lovely. And I guess he was an intellect and in a strange way had a life that, as a sort of working class man who was born in Leicester, probably wouldn't have had, you know, and the acquaintances that he had,
Here is a sidebar, which is about somebody who was frequently described as a freak. In the late 1980s, as Michael Jackson's fame reached stratospheric heights, he became increasingly associated with rumours and myths, and one of the most striking was his supposed attempt to buy Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man's skeleton, from the Royal London Hospital. Some tabloids reported that he'd offered $1 million for the remains. Whether or not the offer was ever formally made, he never denied his deep connection to Joseph Merrick's story. In his autobiography, Moonwalk, he said, "I felt an affinity towards him. He was mocked and isolated because of the way he looked, and I could identify with that. I wonder how it must have felt to live that way. I guess he knew more than most people did." I mean, Joseph Merrick, as Jonathan said, you know, his resilience in the face of public cruelty probably resonated with Michael Jackson, who himself was increasingly scrutinised for his changing appearance. And of course, the Royal London Hospital firmly declined to sell Merrick's remains, but the myth has persisted, and in a way it sort of cemented Michael Jackson's image as a kind of 20th century Elephant Man, a figure simultaneously worshipped and dehumanised by the public eye. And Michael Jackson wasn't the only artist drawn to Joseph Merrick's story. Johnny Depp, another figure closely associated with outsiders and misunderstood characters, also became fascinated with Joseph Merrick, and he went a step further. He acquired one of the most meticulously crafted models of Merrick's skeleton ever produced, created by forensic artists using medical scams and archival research. The replica was stunningly accurate, and for Johnny Depp, deeply symbolic. In an interview, he said, "I've always been drawn to the people who live outside the margins, the ones who aren't accepted easily. People like Joseph Merrick show us the cruelty and beauty of being human." And of course, there is something freakish about the level of fame Depp experiences. His personal collection is filled with relics connected to figures like Joseph Merrick, medical equipment, artifacts related to cultural outsiders. For him, owning a model of Merrick's skeleton wasn't just about morbid curiosity, it was maybe about remembering a life of dignity lived against the odds. And it's worth remembering too, I think, that the cinematic portrayal of Merrick, as Jonathan said, you know, in David Lynch's The Elephant Man, a wonderful film, but of course it reframed the story for a modern audience. He's no longer just a spectacle in that. Through that film, Joseph Merrick's legacy continues to resonate, especially perhaps amongst artists who have felt the sting of judgment and the pressure to conform, or the loneliness of standing apart.
Early to mid-19th century, science was all over the freak show. They loved it and they endorsed it, and freak showmen were grateful for that and used that. By the latter part of the 19th century, the world of medicine started to pathologise difference, explain away the wonder on stage, but also contain the freak body within institutions.
A showman might present somebody as Snake Lady or something like this with a kind of whole narrative around it and publicity to match. And then the medics could come along and say, actually, she has suffered from this condition,
Exactly.
and that's why she looks like this.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is sort of debunks the actual exotic thrill of it somewhat, doesn't it?
Exactly
Right.
so.
And also might make you feel more sympathy in some strange way, you know.
Yeah, it's no longer that appealing to gawp at medical anomaly on stage, whereas staring in amazement at a wonder, and the story in the freak show was so important, explained away the differences which killed the wonder.
Right. Let's talk about a female performer. Tell us about Julia Pastrana.
Oh, Julia Pastrana's story is one of those stranger than fiction stories. She was born in Mexico. She was very short and had she was a bearded lady, had a hirsute body, and kind of double set of teeth. And she was billed as the baboon lady. And she performed, she sang, she danced, and she met a very shadowy, shady man called Theodore Lent, who became her manager. And he put her on stage across Europe. She was displayed in not far from 10 minutes from here, in West London in 1857. They then get married, and she actually gives birth to a baby boy in Russia, born with the same congenital deformities. Unfortunately, the child dies shortly afterwards, as does Julia Pastrana. Now, Theodore Lent, seeing his income melting away, decides to have his dead wife and child embalmed and to continue with the show. So he brings her back to London, embalmed, puts her on display as the nondescript, and continues travelling with her corpse, and actually marries another bearded lady, who's then displayed alongside his dead wife, and billed as her sister.
You couldn't make it up, right? I mean, so the nondescript is hybrid between human and apes. That was what it was. Do we know what Julia thought and felt? And
no idea.
Right.
Again, one of the things that was so difficult writing this book was accessing what they really thought, because there was just very little documentation, memoirs that they left. So we don't know. Did she marry for love? Don't know. Did she feel exploited? Don't know. Did she feel empowered? Did she feel flattered? It's anyone's guess, and I think Theodore Lent shows his true colours when his wife dies anyway.
You have to wonder what was his interest in marrying her? Was it that he could actually get even more power over
Control,
her? Control, right, yeah.
The fact that she was billed as the nondescript is important, because at the time, Darwin's theory of evolution had come out, and again, the freak show using the world of sort of science and medicine to its advantage, she was billed as the missing link between ape and man.
Right, so it ties into that whole thing which people are also fascinated by. Do we come from apes or not?
Yeah.
So here we go. Here's the evidence. Right. Well, what about William Henry Johnson? Zip the Pinhead, right? So in this case, this is just obviously a medical condition, which is exaggerated, right, and exploited, whether he had much agency.
Yeah, so that when we get onto performers who had mental differences, mental difficulties, this question of agency becomes even more complex. And Henry actually built on an earlier exhibition of the kind of pinheads of Maximo and Bartola, who were the mid-19th century billed as the Aztec children, brother and sister who were married in a kind of publicity stunt.
Is that legal?
No, but it was done anyway, and I saw the marriage certificate too. Question mark is were they actually brother and sister? They were billed as brother and sister, and then they were married. It's hard to verify. As ever, truth and fiction really intertwine in the freak show. I don't like to speculate on this too much. I mean, my general feeling with, much like the contemporary entertainment industry, is sometimes the freak show was exploitative, sometimes it wasn't. Now with so-called pinheads, those with mental differences, again, the options for them in the 19th century were exceptionally limited, and by the latter part of the century they were increasingly confined in institutions. And I came across, I can't remember the name of the book now, where a showman, so he's not objective, talks about seeing a freak performer, a pinhead, who had a life in the freak show but was then confined in a mental institution, and goes to this mental institution to see this freak performer who's completely miserable. Right. Not around any friends, not performing, not receiving any praise, isolated, locked away in a mental asylum, and they were horrible. Whereas in the freak show, they had friends, they had movement, they had entertainment.
Which was better.
Better.
Right.
So I'm not advocating that, that was morally acceptable in the 19th century, but it was a different world. And was it better than the alternative? Well, probably.
Right, so it's microcephaly, so it's a condition, very small head, impaired intellectual abilities. He did go on, didn't he, to kind of take a bit more control. I mean, people come to gore with a bit of horror, but I think he did all right in a way, didn't he? He was working with P.T. Barnum again, so maybe Barnum was one of the more enlightened showmen in this case, so that his performance actually did okay as well as he did.
Yeah, and I think even with, Henry is a good example of a performer who had impairments off stage as well as on, but who was still a performer, who still had abilities. This wasn't just about looking and laughing at a innate being. These were performers who had allure, they brought something to life. So, Henry is a good example of that. He didn't just sit on stage. He acted, he performed, he was amusing, and he made a living.
He was also billed as a sort of missing link, wasn't he? And, this plays into these fascination between where we come from, but also maybe some fear as well. Anxieties about evolution and race.
Yeah, and the freak show tapped into that perfectly, wrapped up in a respectable family entertainment. It touched on cultural fears around who we were, where we came from, but also, I would argue, kind of the universal fears of what it means to be normal,
right,
and our own differences and our fears of our own differences and being other and ostracised, and it presented difference that was both physical and cultural, but also ethnic, in a way that was light, amusing, and respectable for the whole family to enjoy.
Right. Now, we've talked about different levels of agency, and some of the performers actually enjoyed it, and for others, well, maybe it was the only option actually to have. Were others held against their will? Were they displayed against their will? Was there actually any outrageous exploitation of people?
Yeah, definitely. I think Joseph Merrick being robbed on the continent is a good example. You've got someone like in the early 19th century, the builders, the Hottentot Venus, Sarah Bartman, who was exploited by managers. And again, she did have some agency. She was a performer, she was a mother, she was a publisher.
What was her particular thing?
Ethnic difference. She had a large bottom. She was from South Africa, and she was displayed for her ethnic otherness. When she died in the early 19th century, her genitals were dissected, and she was put on display in Paris. The exploitation after death was a real factor too. But I have to say, although you see exploitation throughout, it underpins this story of the freak show. It just wasn't, in my research, it just was not as prevalent as I initially suspected. And it wasn't really in the interests of the freak showman to mercilessly exploit their performers. They wanted them to perform on stage and live long and travel around with them. So exploitation occurred, but that's not the only story here.
One hopes that there was a sort of community as well, if you're travelling around with a bunch of other performers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly in the 19th century, when you have, late 19th century, freak performers within sideshows or connected to circuses. There was a whole community there. Todd Browning's film Freaks, one of us. Us. Like, we're a community, we're part, we're connected.
Well, in that film, they literally kind of come together, don't they, to
Yeah,
sort of take vengeance, kill somebody. Right.
Here is a sidebar about the word freak. It's a word that's been used to insult, celebrate, define, liberate. It's got a lot of baggage. It's flown flags, you might even say. But let's start at the beginning. In 16th century English, freak was a fairly innocent word. It meant a kind of whim, a capricious idea, something unexpected or odd. And of course that meaning still lingers on in phrases like a freak of nature, describing things that defy, the usual, a two-headed snake or a snowstorm in July in the Northern Hemisphere. But as we've been discussing, in the 18th and 19th century, freak had shifted. It became attached to this darker side of spectacle, the freak show, and became synonymous with being othered, put on display, or being unnatural. But fast forward to the 50s and 60s, and freak got a radical rebrand. The counterculture took the word back. Psychedelic music, communal living, experimentation with drugs, and spiritual exploration gave rise to the freak scene. And that wasn't just people rejecting the mainstream, they were creating an entirely new way of living. Frank Zappa entitled his 1966 debut album Freak Out, a psychedelic manifesto and a satire of conformity. And in that new world, being a freak was a good thing. You were rejecting societal norms. You were free. You were, in Zappa's words, freaking out, expressing yourself without apology. Don't forget the fabulous furry Freak Brother comics. And the word freaky became, it's like saying you're groovy or fabulous. Fly Your Freak flag from the David Crosby song Almost Cut My Hair was a call to be visibly, proudly yourself, even when that self is strange, awkward or non-conforming. So in a world that pressurised young people to fit in, being freak could feel like an act of courage. And that spirit carried right through into the 70s and 80s. Punks were freaks, queer people, long labelled freaks by mainstream society, began to reclaim the term. It meant survival, self-definition, resistance in goth clubs and drag shows. Being a freak meant being fearless, the beautiful freak. And then in the rave scene of the 90s, the word pulsed through warehouses with glow sticks and breakbeats celebrating wild joy, radical acceptance. And in the 2000s and beyond, freaks just got more flexible. We now talk about being a fitness freak, a tech freak, a freak in the sheets. The word has been absorbed into pop culture and personal identity, spanning from enthusiastic obsession to unapologetic sensuality. I mean, there's quite a few songs with the word freak in it, isn't it? Super Freak, Rick James, 1981, Le Freak, Chic, 1978, Freak Like Me, Adina Howard, 1995, Freak, Lana Del Rey, 2015, Freak on a Leash, Korn, 1998, Get Your Freak On, Missy Elliott, 2001. So, through it all, the word freak has retained its core meaning, being outside the norm. Now it means owning it.
The posthumous sort of exploitation is an interesting one, isn't it? Because we've got here in London, we've got the Hunterian Museum, which of course Hunter, the famous surgeon, of course, and I think now the Irish giant has been taken off display, right? Forgive me, I can't remember his name actually now. The person who became known as the Irish giant had specifically said he did not want to be displayed after he said he wanted to be, I think, buried at sea possibly.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. But in fact his wishes weren't
completely
and it was shown in the Hunterian Museum until fairly recently, I think. It's no longer, right? Yeah.
Julia Pastrana was displayed up until I think it was 2007 when she was finally buried with dignity. Sarah Bartman, Hottentot Venus, was only buried with dignity in 2013. So yes, the posthumous display and exploitation of the body continued. I think it illuminates not only the continued fascination in their body, but also how even when they were alive, they were seen as a financial asset more than just a human being.
How did it decline?
There's a number of different factors. One is the professionalization of medicine, as we've talked about, the explaining away of the anomalies, the rise of medical institutions which increasingly contained the freak show for the freak performer's body. You also had changing tastes. So start of World War I, which produced disabilities on an industrial scale, returning servicemen maimed from the Great War. It no longer seemed that appealing.
Not so funny, right?
Yeah, not so funny. You also had the freak show almost became a victim of its own success. It became so popular that there was no way they could up the ante any further, and it sort of started to decline and face competition from other forms of entertainment. So it was a changing entertainment industry, increased regulation as well. So entertainment venues were increasingly regulated. They introduced the so-called Aliens Act, which made it harder for international performers to come to Britain. You had competition, you had the Great War, and slowly but surely the freak show started to, as we understand it, the Victorian freak show anyway started to...
All the massive explosion of music hall. You've got film, of course. Film's coming. So
sport.
Yeah. There's a lot of other things to do. So you've got changing tastes, maybe some moral reprehension as well, maybe in the wake of the war, where disability and freakishness in that sense were definitely not funny anymore.
That's it. And then post the Second World War, the rise of the disability rights movement and other civil rights movement wanted to see people with disabilities accommodated into the social fabric, not ostracized and pointed out as different. And yet there was a strange paradox in the 20th century whereby the freak show, defined as sort of the commercialized display of physical difference for amusement and profit, declined, while at the same time the freak performer proliferated in other forms of popular culture, from cinema to magazines to photography. Diane Arbus, for example, took photographs of a number of freak performers. And the freak show kind of metamorphosized into different entertainment that we still have today, from talk shows to our obsession with different bodies.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because we were talking just before we started about that. And to back up a little bit, so the Victorian freak show, as we know it, kind of declines, but it carries on. It carries on in circuses and various other things, and maybe in different parts of the world as well. It's not like it's completely disappeared, right? Brings us up to where we are now, and I guess a freak performer now would probably almost certainly have agency. They would be doing it because they've chosen to do it, right? But what are our modern freak shows then? John, we were talking before about the Netflix series about cosmetic surgery disasters or people who are massively overweight. We still like to gawp, don't we?
We're still fascinated with it. And if you think like the kind of three ingredients of the freak show, the sensationalization, the titillation, and that obsession with the body, that kind of plays out in so many different cultural forums today. I mean, I think TV talk shows are a good example.
You mentioned that the Jeremy Kyle show.
Jeremy Kyle, I mean, you're just wheeling out the socially bewildered and holding them up for ridicule and laughing at them. Those deemed different.
Yeah, they're freakish, not necessarily in a physical sense, but in a lifestyle sense or an attitude sense, right? Or in a relationship sense.
Yeah.
And they're wheeled out, as you say, and the producers of those shows kind of goad them into, confrontations live on air and stuff like this, right? And
exactly.
When we're sitting there, gawping with a kind of mixture of horror, a little bit of shame and sort of fascination.
Yeah, and relief. Thank God it's not me.
And relief. That's it. Thank God it's not me.
Yeah.
And look at them. It kind of reinforces our own position, whatever it is, doesn't it, by not being them.
Yeah, exactly.
Way, right?
And yet there's something within us that they connect us to. Leslie Fiedler talked about our primordial fears. There is something there in that difference which speaks to us on a much deeper psychological level. But there you have titillation, sensationalism, difference. And those ingredients that were the raison d'etre of the freak show play out in those talk shows. In our obsession with bodily deformities and gossip magazines, obsessing about, whether some celebrities put on a bit of weight or not.
Right. Or delighting, not only obsessing, right?
Yeah, or delighting. It's still very much with us, I would say.
We might be repulsed and shocked and take the moral high ground if a freak show came to town, but actually we'll be at home watching this stuff on Netflix.
Yeah, 100%.
We haven't changed that much then.
No, we're hypocrites.
I mean, and for you, sort of, looking at that period, what are the things which you sort of stood out for you most? I mean, possibly in terms of the people that stood out most and, affected you most in terms of your research?
It was definitely the human stories, and it was a frustration, but also a fascination that I couldn't access what they thought. That was very hard, occasionally through letters and some autobiographies, but even then they were written within the context of the freak show, so the veracity was very questionable. It was the fact that this was a central facet of Victorian life, that Queen Victoria herself, she was a freak fancier. I mean, Buckingham Palace was a revolving door for freak performers in the 1840s and 1850s in particular. And so it recreated for me the Victorian age. It became the age of the freak, the age of wonder. And I think personally it touched on my own fears and fascinations and insecurities around the body. And still with me.
Dr. John Jacob Woolf, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me.
So, as the curtain closes on another episode, I want to thank John. I'm going to put a link to his work in the show notes. It was a complicated world, wasn't it, the Victorian Freak Show? Got me thinking quite a bit. I mean, these spaces where, human difference was sort of exploited and, paradoxically, offered opportunity. Very intriguing. And, of course, this whole thing about how they mirrored the society itself and make us reflection on our own perceptions of what's normal and abnormal, what's other, is very thought-provoking, I think. I mean, who do we think are freaks? Who do we laugh at or are shocked by? Some politicians, perhaps? I also thought it was very interesting how, up until the sort of 50s, the highest social values seemed to be normal, to be conventional, and then suddenly the counterculture comes along and actually, no, you don't want to be normal, you want to be other, you want to be individual, you want to be different. So the word freak itself suddenly takes on a new light, and being freaky becomes a bit of a compliment. Just at the moment at the Tate Modern in London, there's an exhibition of work and the life of Lee Bowery. If you're familiar with Lee Bowery, you'll probably know what I'm going to say next. He was one of the 20th century's most provocative performance artists and talented fashion designers, I would say. But there is something freakish about his costumes and about him, really. Intentionally so. He was a boundary-pushing performer and unapologetically presented himself and dismantled conventions around gender, beauty, ugliness, grotesqueness and identity. It simultaneously manages to be a bit alarming, inspirational, funny, and a little bit poignant because of course Lee died at the age, I think, of 34, maybe even younger. But it's really worth checking out if you get a chance to. Thanks for listening, and let's keep listening. Let's keep exploring lost cultures that continue to shape the present as well as are interesting from the past, and I will see you further down the road, over the hillsides, around the bend for more of these tales from the underground. And the music that you're going to hear and you've been hearing is from an album called Junk Shop Melodies by The Real Tuesday World, which is about to come out in the next couple of months. I hope you enjoy. See you next time.